good to see you on this wonderful St. Patrick's Day. How many of you love St. Patrick's Day? How many think you love it more than me? You know better? Well, St. Patrick, was actually Scottish, but we'll get into that. I got some Scottish people in the house. I have 25% Scottish, is that right? When we did the ancestry? What? Oh, I do, okay. I have 25% Scottish, so me and St. Patrick were distant relatives somehow. I like to believe that anyway, after I found out, right, that he was Scottish. Anyway, so back like a long time ago, I'd say this was early 2000s, I had the chance to spend Thanksgiving with my dad and my uncle and a bunch of my relatives, and this is on the Jewish side of my family. So I told you I was 25% Scottish. I have 50% of this sort of amalgamation of Jewish, Eastern European, anyway. So my relatives on my dad's side, full Jewish, and I remember going to this, I didn't get the bar mitzvah, but I got to go to my cousin's bar mitzvahs. And I remember meeting a bunch of these relatives, and you ever been to a bar mitzvah before? Dude, they are off the hook, right? They're amazing. They are a party. Like, they know how to party. Anyway. So I went to this Thanksgiving, and I got the chance to meet one of my great aunts. And we were actually going over to her house. And I felt kind of excited about it. Like, I'd never met her, but I knew a lot of history with her. Like, she had been through the Holocaust. She was a Holocaust survivor. And so I was excited to get to maybe ask some questions or learn more about that, part of my heritage. And that was cool. I was going in, and I remember entering the house, and she greeted me, actually greeted my dad, and then greeted me, said, "Oh, so this is the Gentile boy." Immediately, I felt a little okay, what do I do here? What am I to you now? What, am I unwelcome? What is, it was weird. I ran through all the different scenarios in my head. Because, as you know, if your mom, in the Jewish custom, if your mom is Christian, then you are Christian, meaning you're a Gentile and not a Jew. And so I went through this dinner and all this stuff, and it was cool, but I felt really uncomfortable the whole time because she kept saying it. Matthew's the Gentile boy. And I'm like, can we just get past that for 1 second? I don't want to be that anymore. I just want to be Matt. I'm here. I'm hanging out. And it made me feel kind of uncomfortable and kind of out of place and kind of like I didn't belong. And have you ever felt that way in a place? It's funny. Some of you might feel that way right now, today, here at church. And, those who are sort of accustomed to this, we gather on Sunday mornings, and they wouldn't know. They wouldn't understand. If I'm speaking to you, those who might find a little bit of discomfort or man, what is this place all about? And they wouldn't understand that, the sort of thought process that goes behind what should I wear? I don't know how they dress, or how should I interact? What do I do during this singing time? What do I do with my hands? Do I do that? What does this mean? Do I do? What are they do? What is this about? How do I interact with people? And what if I say something wrong? What if I'm maybe being secretly judged by something that I said or did out of complete ignorance to what this is supposed to look like? Quote. There are many in this room that could feel that way, and those who are just used to this, used to our language that we use. We use a language? Did you know that? And we expect in many ways, people who come in to understand that language. I don't even know if I fully understand the language sometimes, right? But there's a flow. There's a language to what we do here. And that can be uncomfortable for some. And it's hard to feel like you belong in a place, just already, right? How many of you just have a hard time feeling like you belong in a place, especially a new place, right? It's just, do I belong here? It's hard enough to just belong in a place, to feel like you belong in a place. It's even harder to feel like you belong in a place that's foreign to you, in an experience that's totally different to you. And it's hard for hosts to create a safe place where you feel seen, where you feel wanted and in an environment that's foreign to you. And taking the time to make you feel welcome in a place like this, it takes intentionality, right? It takes hard work. Putting it bluntly, it takes humility and selflessness on the part of the hosts, right? So today, I want to attempt to talk to both of us, to talk to those who are comfortable and to those who find themselves possibly uncomfortable in an environment like this. I want to try to talk to both of us, as hard as that is. And I want to talk about an ethos, a cultural statement that we have at Rhapsody, a way that we are becoming. Let's say we haven't arrived and may never fully arrive, but we're becoming this. And I want to talk about this statement, belong before you believe. Belong before you believe. What does that mean? How does that look? What's that all about? To do so, to start the conversation, we're going to talk about St. Patrick's Day. We're going to talk about St. Patrick himself. You guys interested in St. Patrick? The real St. Patrick? Did you know there was a real guy? I had somebody today tell me they thought that he was made up. That they just came up with this thing so they could have an Irish holiday. Just telling you, there's people that don't even know that he's a real person. Like, he was a real person. He was born in AD 385, right? So this is like 3rd century guy. So this is back in the day. And he was born, like I said, he's Scottish of origin, but he lived in England, which is Roman-occupied England at the time. And he was what was referred to as a Briton. And Britons were the Celtic people who lived in Roman-occupied England. Now, he grew up, it's said that he was a pretty wily youth. He wasn't necessarily he had a Christian family, and his grandfather was a priest. But he was not into all that. He knew what it was all about, but he was wily, right? And between the age of 14 and 16, somewhere in there, he was actually captured by Celtic Irish pirates. That is we're talking pirates now. This is kind of a cool story. He gets captured by these Irish Celtic pirates and taken to Ireland, where he's then held captive, right? So he's a slave in Ireland at the age of 14 to 16, somewhere in there. Now, through this time, he's actually a sheep herder. That was his main job as a slave. And so as a sheep herder, he's out in nature almost all day long. Sometimes he's out in crazy, dangerous areas. And so he begins to see God throughout all nature. And he remembers all of the things that he had learned as a youngster. And he actually becomes a devout Christian within that time frame, 14 to 20, right? And it's said, he wrote in his autobiography, it's called Confessions, he wrote that as time progressed through the course of that 6-year period, he actually grew to love his captors. That the people who had enslaved him, he began to love them, began to love the Irish people. And in many ways, he says, they kind of became my people. And so he learned their language, He learned their customs, he learned their ways, and all of the things that made these Irish Celtic people Irish. At the age of 20, he had a dream, and in this dream, he heard this voice say, "Your ship is ready." So he said, "Go to the shore." He goes to the shoreline early in the morning, right? And he catches a ship, and he actually bargains his way on board the ship, and it takes him back to England where he's reunited with his family. It's crazy stuff, isn't it? This dude had a harrowing adventure. I'm just telling you that. So when he's back in England for the next 25 years of his life, so he's 20 right at this point, right? For the next 25 years of his life, it's kind of sketchy on exactly when certain things happened. So if anybody tries to tell you definitive timelines, just it's 385, and there's a lot of different things. But I'll tell you that we do know for a fact that these things happen within the 25 years, what I'm about to tell you. So he goes to school, and he studies and becomes a priest. And in that time frame, sometime, he had another dream. So you can tell this guy, God speaks to him through these dreams, right? He has another dream where an angel hands him a letter, right, from his captors. And this letter says, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." It changed his life. He said, "I've got to go back, and I've got to go back to these people because they need Jesus. They need the gospel." And so he trained even harder from that point on. He became a bishop. And he took a team of people, right? He developed this whole team of people, and he took them to Ireland and to minister to the people of Ireland. I'll tell you a little bit more of the story, but it's important that we pause there to understand that Patrick's contemporaries thought that this mission he was going on was a total lost cause. He thought him going to Ireland was a total lost cause. Do you want to know why? Sorry, I'm trying to make sure you're still awake out there. The reason is because they thought of the Irish Celtic people as barbarians. They called them barbarians. And what they meant by that is that they weren't civilized enough to bring the gospel to. No joke. They weren't civilized enough to bring the gospel to them. Now, Romans believed that barbarians were unreachable because the Roman way of evangelism, and for those of you who don't understand our language, evangelism is kind of a fancy word for we're going to take the gospel to a person or people group and convey to them what the gospel is. But they thought that it was contingent on, in order for us to bring the gospel to a people group or a person, they have to be civilized first. So civilized came before Christianized to them. So you can't bring Christ into an uncivilized place. What does that do to you? What does that do in your heart? What does that make you think about? Because for me, I was reading that, and as I'm processing this, I'm thinking, this seems crazy to me. Does it seem crazy to any of you? And the process was very interesting. So the Roman process of taking Jesus to somebody or presenting the gospel or evangelism, right? The Roman process was this. Make someone more civilized. This is point number one. This is the first thing you do. Make someone more civilized. In other words, make them more like us. Present the Christian message. Invite them to decide to believe. And if they believe, welcome them into the church and its fellowship. That's the Roman way. Now, before you judge this, which I know many of you are because I judged it too, it's important we take a look in the mirror. And this book provides some insight into that It's called The Celtic Way of Evangelism. It's by George G. Hunter III. I highly recommend it. But listen to this, what he kind of surmises based on some of this and how he brings it into our culture. Again, the ancient Roman church's de facto policy that people who were not culturally Roman were barbarian and therefore were unfit for Christianization seems ludicrous when viewed through history's rearview mirror. Most churches today, however, expect pre-Christian people to be like church people culturally. They're expected to understand and speak the church's accent and vocabulary, to share the church's aesthetic preferences, to dress and look like church people, to vote like church people, to live their lives in ways that church people can approve, and so on. If they are not already like us, they may never be invited to any church. Here's the thing. The Roman model is actually a model that we're very used to. It's more subtle in a lot of ways, and it's in some ways you have to be very, very determined in order to see it. But we will constantly have to choose a different way. Do you know that? We will constantly have to choose a different way because most of us have been inundated with the Roman way of evangelism, whether we know it or not. Whether you grew up in the church or you didn't grow up in the church, but you know church people or you've been in contact with church people, then you know that the mindset that we're constantly warring against is you have to believe before you belong. That's the mindset that we're inundated with. And it works its way out in different ways, right? At least in order to fully belong here, you need to believe in certain ways. And we looked at that in kind of the way that it looked like. But so that was the Roman way, right? And we have to fight against the Roman way. We do. We have to fight against the Roman way. Here's what Patrick was determined. He was determined to introduce a new way based on his understanding of Jesus and the gospel. And we have to be determined as well. Patrick loved the Irish. He loved the Irish people. They became his people. He learned their language, their issues, and their ways. He learned their language, their issues, and their ways. There's no shortcut to this. There's absolutely it takes time and intentionality to learn language, culture, values, all those types of things, right? But he was committed to it. He was committed to understanding them. They engaged the tribal kings, so this is how when they went in, right? The first was they deeply loved these people. The second thing was they went in and engaged the tribal kings and the druids, right? So they were big into luck and magic and all of those types of things, and they had druids, they had witch doctors, right? Like all of these things were pervasive in Ireland at the time. And so they would engage these kings, the kings of the tribes, along with the druids of the tribes, because really the kings and the druids were at kind of an equal sitting, because people would go to these druids with all of their problems, right? All of their we'll call it the middle problems, like I need to get a job. You can think of it like that, right? I need a job. I need to feel better. This is how they thought they could kind of heal and learn all of the normal everyday life stuff. They went to druids to do that. And so Patrick and his team would engage these people first. And they hoped and prayed that those people would come to believe in Jesus. But even if they didn't, their other intention was, will you let us camp near your tribe? Like, will you just let us camp out here and interact with people? And many times, they would allow them to do that. And so they would camp out in these settlements, and they would interact with people. They'd pray for people. They would perform miracles. All of these types of things. They'd serve people. Eventually, they'd build what's called monastic communities. We don't have time to get into what those are and what those look like, but they were amazing. Amazing places where people could seek refuge from everything that was going on in their everyday life. And they invited people in with hospitality that's really unheard of and actually still prevails in Ireland. I don't know if anyone's been to Ireland. I haven't. It's on my bucket list. But from what I hear, there's like the hospitality there is amazing. That they just love to welcome people. And this, in many ways, I feel started with what Patrick brought to them. They didn't seek to make the Irish more like them. Instead, they asked the Holy Spirit to show Christ to these people with the inclinations they already had towards God. So he didn't say you've got to become more civilized in order to, or more like us, more like the Romans. Instead, what are the ways in which God's already showing up in your life? Right? He would use the three-leaf clover. Many of you have heard this probably, but as a way to describe to them the Trinity. And they would understand it. It helped them to understand what that was about. He would talk about all of these things, and they would help them understand God is literally pursuing you, and he's already pursued you. Just to lean into him. And so he found ways to take that heart to them without changing who they were. Patrick's way of evangelism was in stark contrast to the Roman way. I want to just read this to you. So, you already know the Roman model. This was the Celtic model. This was St. Patrick and his team's model. The Celtic model for reaching people, number one, establish community with people or bring them into the fellowship of your community of faith. Two, within fellowship, engage in conversation, ministry, prayer, and worship. And three, in time, as they discover that they now believe, invite them to commit. So you can see that he gave people the opportunity to belong before they believe. That you can come into our community, you can have fellowship with our community before you even believe the same things. And as long as it takes, and even if you don't, we have this place for you where you can belong here. You can find safety here. You can find community here. We'll pray for you. We'll serve you. And sometime along the way, you'll probably find that you do believe. But even if you don't, and until then, we are here to serve you. We're here to be community for you. Do you know that through this, they prove this by their actions? Through this, Patrick and his team planted around 700 churches in Ireland. 700 churches. And he ordained, it said, about 1,000 priests. 700 churches, 1,000 priests, and it's recorded that around 40 of Ireland's 150 tribes became substantially Christian. Belong before you believe. Now, we want this to be a community where people can belong before they believe, right? That's one of the statements that's come out of this year. And this is what I'm talking about. When I say that, when you hear that said, when you wonder what that's about, that's what I'm talking about. That's why St. Patrick's Day is so special to me. It's why I love it so much and why I love the way that he pursued the Irish people. Because there's something so special about that heart that says you can belong before you believe. But it's not, it's easy to say, right? Hard to practice. Very hard to practice. It takes determination in our hearts and our minds. It takes willing submission to Jesus. And it takes humility. Humility to remember that Jesus came for me in my brokenness, right? Yeah, exactly. In my brokenness, in my selfishness, and in my enmity toward him. That's when he came to me. That's when he came to you too. And sometimes it's hard to remember that. When we've become self-righteous, it's hard to remember how Jesus came to us. And I want to be a community where Jesus can come to people like that. In that same way he came to me, a broken, messed up boy that desperately needed Jesus. And you know what the difference between that 14-year-old boy and 41-year-old Matt is? Age. I still need Jesus every single day. In the same way I needed him then. There's no difference. Honestly. Maybe I've matured in some ways. I've bared some fruit of knowing him. I have the Spirit of God in me, and there's things that come of that, yes. But there is not a day that goes by where I need Jesus any less than I needed him on that first day. And we have to remember that. If we're going to truly be a place where people can belong before they believe, we have to remember our own selves. I need a place where I can belong, right? I needed a place. If you know my story, I don't have time to tell it today, but if you know my story, I needed a place where I belonged before I believed. 100%. And I found it. Thank God. And I want people to find it because it's getting harder and harder to find. But I want people to find it. And I'll tell you, the religious elite in Jesus' day struggled with this too. They really did. They hated who Jesus chose. They hated who Jesus ate with. They hated who Jesus ministered to. They hated who Jesus touched. And they hated who he let touch him. They hated his interpretation of power and how it was used to serve. They hated everything about him, so much so that they constantly wanted to kill him, and obviously eventually succeeded in that. But that was his plan all along. Either way, they did not like him or his ways. And I'll show you, let's read Luke 7:24, and this is where we'll wrap it up. This is speaking of a time when John's disciples joined up with Jesus, and John had gone away. And so he's now speaking to John's ex-disciples, who are now his disciples. In verse 24, it says, after John's disciples left, Jesus began talking about him to the crowds. What kind of man did you go into the wilderness to see? Was he a weak reed, swayed by every breath of wind? Or were you expecting to see a man dressed in expensive clothes? No. People who wear beautiful clothes and live in luxury are found in palaces. Were you looking for a prophet? Yes, and he is more than a prophet. John is the man to whom the scriptures refer when they say, look, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way before you. I tell you, of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John. Yet even the least person in the kingdom of God is greater than he is. When they heard this, all the people, even tax collectors, agreed that God's way was right. This is really important for you to catch. Even the tax collectors agreed that God's way was right, for they had been baptized by John. Verse 30. But the Pharisees and experts in religious law rejected God's plan for them, for they had refused John's baptism. To what can I compare the people of this generation, Jesus asked. How can I describe them? They're like children playing a game in the public square. They complain to their friends, we played wedding songs and you didn't dance, so we played funeral songs and you didn't weep. For John the Baptist didn't spend his time eating bread or drinking wine, and you say he's possessed by a demon. The Son of Man, on the other hand, feasts and drinks, and you say he's a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and other sinners. But wisdom is shown to be right by the lives of those who follow it. See, Jesus, they didn't like who he hung out with, who he ate with, how he did his ministry. They didn't agree with it. They didn't like it. They rejected it. And in so doing, they rejected people who desperately needed him, who desperately needed God. They rejected those people. So how do we become those who embody this statement, belong before you believe? There's a lot I could say, but I'll whittle it down to 3 things that I think can help us tremendously in becoming a place and a people, because it's not just here. What shows up here is what? Us, right? We show up here. There's chairs, there's lights, there's TVs, there's a wonderful feast out there. And all that's great, but the truth is that we show up here. We gather here together. And so you bring you here, and I bring me here. And so if we don't become this personally, if you don't become this personally, if I don't become this personally, then we won't become this corporately. We have to internalize this. So how do we do this? I think number 1 is hospitality. So it's something I see in Patrick, it's something I see in Jesus. And even though Jesus didn't invite others into his home, which he did not have, by the way, he did constantly enter into people's homes. And hospitality is much more, by the way, than just inviting people over and giving them a nice time. The word actually means family love for the stranger. Family love for the stranger. Did Jesus have family love for the stranger? I'd say he's the embodiment of that. Family love for the stranger. Who do you invite into your life? And how do you treat them? How do you treat the people who you've invited into your life? Do you treat them with kindness? Do you treat them with generosity? These are important things to ask ourselves. How do we treat those who we've invited into our lives? But first, we have to get past the first layer, which is who do we invite into our lives? Are we so Roman that we only invite those who are like us? That in order for us to take the gospel to someone, they've got to at least morally be the same as us? They've got to at least adopt the same values as us? That wasn't a prerequisite to God going to the barbarians. We're barbarians. I think the second thing is relational intentionality. So if hospitality is who you're bringing into your life, I think relational intentionality is the second. This is how I'll say that. When you're having conversations with people, are you having conversations to be right? Or are you having conversations in order to learn and understand someone's language, issues, ways? And where are we willing to go to build these relationships? It's a question. Where are we willing to go to pursue these relationships? Because conversation, if you understand it, is supposed to be this, right? Back and forth, talking to each other, learning from each other, dialogue. But nowadays, conversation has become, I'm going to shut my mouth but be thinking about how I'm going to respond to what you're saying. That's basically the gist of conversation these days. And real conversation, the kind of conversation that the Celtics had, was the kind that sought understanding, What is it that God's already working on in your heart and your life? If you're not listening, you won't ever know. If you're just trying to figure out how to evangelize them, how to turn them to Jesus, you'll never listen for the ways that Jesus is trying to get their heart already. This is a lesson I've learned over a lot of time. Sometimes we have to really listen to a person's heart to understand where they're coming from and where God's already speaking to them. God is pursuing us, right? Then he's already, he was pursuing the Irish people before Patrick ever stepped foot in that nation. He was pursuing those people. He was pursuing me before I ever stepped foot in that church. He was pursuing me. He was pursuing you, and he's pursuing people. We need to listen more. Incline our hearts to people. Understand why they're in pain. Understand what the issues are. Understand what these things they're going through. Understand the language in order to move forward and share Christ in a meaningful way. And I would say the third, possibly most important, would be abiding in Jesus and learning his ways. I'll say it like this because I think this is the most blunt and easy way to say it. We can only represent somebody that we know. We can only truly represent well somebody who we know. And if you don't know Jesus, Christian, I'm talking to you. If you don't know Jesus, and yet you're trying to represent him in this world, you're doing a bad job. I say that because if I don't know Luke, if I just presume to know what Luke's about, if I just think I know the way that Luke thinks, if I haven't given the chance to talk to him or spend time with him, but then I go and I try to represent Luke to some of you over here, I guarantee I'm going to do a bad job because I didn't take the time. I didn't develop the relationship. I didn't learn his ways. I didn't learn the way that he works. I'm just assuming. And there's a lot of that happening. And I will just say that the most important thing is abiding in Jesus and learning his ways so that you can represent him well in this world. I want nothing more than to represent Jesus for who he really is and how he really wants to communicate to people, not my own interpretation of that. So hospitality, relational intentionality, and abiding in Jesus and learning his ways. Those are three really distinct ways I think we can determine our hearts to help people to belong before they believe. I really believe that. And that's in our lives. This has to be walked out in the way that we interact with people and walked out, obviously, here at Rhapsody. This is really important to me, and I want it to be equally as important for all of us. But I can't make it that important for you. I can't do that. It's not something I can't speak eloquently enough to make you want to love people in that way. And so this is what I'll do. I'm going to give you a moment before we go and eat some wonderful food to close your eyes. And simply abide in Jesus. If it's a weird concept to you, you can simply ask him. There was a great song back in the day. I think the bridge was, "Break my heart for what breaks yours." It's a simple yet effectively powerful prayer. Break my heart for what breaks yours. Help me to love people the way that you love people. In fact, maybe a prayer you could pray that would help is, help me to love people the way that you loved me, the way that you love me. Because it reminds us in that moment of how Jesus came to us in our brokenness, in our humanity. And if we'll take the time to do this regularly, he can develop in us the heart that breaks for people, that loves people enough to engage with them in meaningful ways. There's new barbarians everywhere. The Irish people weren't the last barbarians on earth. Those who didn't fit in, those who didn't go along with what it was thought to be Christian. They found Jesus. There's a lot of new barbarians out there now that need to find Jesus. Let's get busy showing them who he is. So Lord, help us today. Thank you for the life of your servant, St. Patrick, who we celebrate his life today. I thank you for the example, the way that you used him on this earth. We don't put him on a pedestal. We know he wasn't perfect. But what he did do was he followed you into the unknown, into a crazy circumstance that no one else thought was possible. And you moved in a powerful way. And so I pray for us today, Rhapsody Church, and those who are visiting in here or guests or trying to figure out if they want to stay here or be here, I pray that we'd be a place where people can belong before they believe. And that in that journey they would find you, Jesus, the real you, the one we want to represent well. I pray that as we go out, as we interact with people, as we go to work, school, all the places of influence that we go to, that you would be represented well by us. Thank you for today. Thank you for the feast we're about to enjoy. I pray that you would bless the food to our bodies. And I thank you for each and every person here today. And I'll end with a Celtic prayer. It's one of St. Patrick's prayers. It's called St. Patrick's Breastplate. I won't read the whole thing because you'd be in here he prayed a lot, so. But I'm going to read this end part. May Christ protect me today against poison and burning, against drowning and wounding, so that I may have abundant reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me. Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me. Christ to right of me, Christ to left of me. Christ in my lying, Christ in my sitting, Christ in my rising. Christ in the heart of all who think of me. Christ on the tongue of all who speak to me. Christ in the eye of all who see me. Christ in the ear of all who hear me. I rise today in power, strength, invoking the Trinity, believing in threeness, confessing the oneness of creation's creator. For to the Lord belongs salvation, and to the Lord belongs salvation, and to Christ belongs salvation. May your salvation, Lord, be with us always. Amen.